Okay, so this next section is on spores and pollen and seeds. And you're like, what? Why am I learning about that again? Didn't I get that in biology? Well, I hope you did because I taught you about this. But this actually is a little portion of evidence as well. Now, I'm not going to say that this is in every crime scene, but especially some of the crime scenes that occur outside, or maybe something where a body has been retrieved and the actual place of maybe where the crime occurred is not where they found the body. So this is one other way to find out a little bit more about maybe the primary crime scene or the secondary crime scene and where things happened. So before I get into that, let's talk about some quick basics. A spore. What is a spore? Okay, pretty much all plants produce spores. Spores are these little teeny little things here that are they help to pollinate plants, but also they're like indestructible. I love talking about spores and looking at the kind of what a spore looks like, because they can survive for tons and tons of time depending on where they are, but they can survive kind of the harshest environments. So it's kind of interesting, just the chemical and physical makeup of a spore. Spores are pretty hardy, but they aid in reproduction typically. So here's just, this has a light micrograph of the sporangia, which are, these are the spore sacs, and then the spores of a male fern. So anyways, spores, again, you'll find them pretty much from every plant, but they kind of look different in different plants. There are different types of plants. We have seed plants that basically, produce seeds. So it's not necessarily kind of the spores that we would think of, but they still are, pollen grains basically that aid in that reproduction for flowers. Okay. Well, all of these things, pollen and spores have very hardy kind of encasings that just allow them to survive for long periods of time, whether it's in someone's body, if there was a crime committed, or on the surface of something, or whatever that might be. But basically what this picture is showing is this is showing the pollen grains, which actually contain sperm. So these are the little teeny pollen, and you guys have, you guys know a little bit because hopefully you've taken biology, because that's kind of a prereq for this class. But basically these pollen grains are what is then going to fertilize a flower. Okay, so this is the male sperm part of it, and then the female part is typically within the plant, within the flowering plant. Okay, so, but nonetheless, like spores, pollen grains are released and then they're carried by wind, water, insects, all sorts of things, okay? And I think that mentions it right down there. So, interesting about these things, a little bit of background on them, and hopefully from taking biology you remember some of this stuff. But when you know kind of the, what these do, not so necessarily in the reproduction of flowers, but how they survive, then it starts to, kind of pull in some evidence. If this stuff is found on somebody, we can, criminalists and forensic scientists, and I'll tell you about some of the specific people that do this, so if you're ever interested in plants, and forensic science, there's a job for you. So it's kind of cool because forensic science can pull in all of these different scientific, kind of, what do I call it? Scientific different realms. That's not the word I'm thinking of, but if you like plants, if you like insects, if you like, this and that, but yet you want to be a part of the crime scene investigation, it's very interesting that there's so many different facets of this that you can study and be a part of in the crime scene investigation. So anyway, sorry, I'll keep moving on. So seeds are formed in the ovary or flower. I'm not going to go over this in depth because this is something that you can read and kind of brush up on. I want to explain the importance of these when it comes to investigating a crime scene. But nonetheless, I'll go through these pictures with you. It says when pollen's transferred to the pistil of a flower, okay, which is where the female parts are found, it extends the tube into the ovaries where the seed is formed. So basically, that pollen grain is going to, fertilize that, and then the seed will form kind of in the bottom here, okay? It says a seed is an embryonic plant contained within a seed coat. Okay, so you'll have the seed that starts to form, and you can have this lovely little plant that forms. Seeds vary, okay, according to the plant type. So this conifer produces seeds above the scale of the cone, okay? What else? Fruits, obviously. This is, if you guys took me for bio, you guys did a in-depth kind of a lab that has to do with the fruits of, or the seeds of a fruit. And then sometimes fruits resemble seeds. The fairies that blow off a dandelion are actually fruits. So anyways, just a little FYI. I'm not going to go into this in detail because I want you guys to know the forensics part of it too, but please read this because you'll notice that that's important information still. Okay, so it says criminalists must locate botanical evidence. I almost couldn't say that word for a moment. So botanical evidence at a crime scene. So the interesting thing is you go to a crime scene, wherever maybe this might be, and all of a sudden you might find spores, pollen, which sometimes are microscopic, but sometimes not. It depends. Spores tend to be really hard to see. But pollen, you can see that pollen dust. Sometimes you guys, if you've ever touched a flower and you see kind of that of the yellowness, that's pollen. We can actually see that dust. And then you can actually examine that in a microscope, typically a scanning electron microscope, that you can really see the details of that pollen. And why we want that? Well, we want to figure out where this person came from possibly, or maybe if this person was dragged through something. Typically when they do these type of spore, pollen, and seeds evidence analysis, it's typically if maybe they find a body somewhere out in the woods or something like that, or maybe someone's been missing for quite a long time, or things like that where they're trying to figure out a little bit more about where things happened. So basically this page is kind of telling you a little bit more of how to go about getting those samples. So it says it should be collected with forceps or adhesive tape. So if you see kind of some pollen, or you might think maybe there's some spores there, you could just use some adhesive tape and get that. And that obviously is going to have some great evidence on there. They should be dried to prevent contamination by molds, okay, because there's still some moisture within there. It says between each sample, tools should either be cleaned or a fresh tool should be used. That way you're not contaminating one, pollen sample from another. And then samples on a body should be collected prior to removing the body. Okay, so again, when someone gets to that crime scene, typically you might have a botanist, a forensic botanist, that might be analyzing, if there's any pollen or spores available. Okay. Now here's just a page that I think is kind of cool. So it talks about some of the different facets of forensic science, which, a forensic scientist can do many different things. You could be a forensic botanist, so you're going to examine that botanical evidence, which could be anywhere from plants, spores, flowers, you name it, that whatever might be around that victim, to figure out, where maybe the primary scene was, where if this was the primary scene, and so forth, okay? Because pollen, and I guess I didn't mention this before, pollen and spores are typically, they're very specific to their area, okay? So if you find a particular, spore or pollen grain, then that typically is going to be found in a specific region. And if that person is in a different region where the pollen does not match when you look under a comparison microscope, then you know that that might be a secondary crime scene, and maybe that body was taken there, okay? So there's a lot of things that you can find out from that. You also have a forensic botanist who specializes in spores and pollen, called a palynologist, which I've never heard that term before, but there you go. New one for me too. Ha ha! Okay, so anyways, these scientists will use these SEMs, the scanning electron microscope, to really look at those pollen and those spores, to kind of do some good analyzing to figure out where they came from. All right, and then so again, like I said, different regions have different characteristic pollen patterns. So based on what they find, so these are some scanning electron microscope images, which I think are pretty cool, of some of these different types of pollen and what they look like. You might only find this in one particular region, so you know that maybe that person came from there. Again, there's another story, an actual crime that is talked about in the beginning and the end of this unit, or this quick little lesson. So make sure you read that, because that's another prime example of how they figured out what was going on, where this body came from, and so forth. Okay? So that is it on spores and pollen. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit more of a background for this portion. All right. See you next time.